All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Mandy Sally. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our May Censorship Series program, which is, I say this every month, but I'm very excited about it because we are going to be talking about the results of a study that Woodhull commissioned. It's been a long time in the making, and so I'm really, really thrilled to be able to share it with all of you today. And I'm going to introduce my two fabulous, brilliant panelists in just a second. But before I get to that, a few little housekeeping rules. Please feel free to make use of that Zoom chat. I would love to hear your thoughts or questions throughout our presentation today. And we often have some great conversations during these panels in the Zoom chat. So please feel free. Also, want to let you know that this will be recorded and available on our YouTube page after our Zoom today. So if you have to duck out early or whatever the case may be, please don't fret. It will be on YouTube and you can watch it at a later time and share it with all your friends. And I will also be sending a follow-up email with any links or resources we talk about today. So no need to jot down furious notes. I will send it all to you probably within the next 24 hours or so. So again, thanks everybody for being here. And I want to introduce you to my two fabulous panelists for today. First up, we have Dr. Melissa Ditmore. She is a consultant specializing in issues of gender, development, health, and human rights, particularly as they relate to marginalized populations like sex workers, migrants, trafficked persons, and people who use drugs. Welcome. Thank you for being here, Melissa.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And we also have Dr. Samantha Majic. She is an author, researcher, and professor of political science at John Jay College, CUNY, and a member of the doctoral faculty in the political science and criminal justice programs at the CUNY Graduate Center. Thank you also for being here today, Sam.
Thanks for having us, Mandy.
Yeah. So I'm gonna sort of lay the groundwork for folks and tell them a little bit about this study, and then we're gonna get into the results and all the really exciting stuff. But essentially, a couple years ago, Woodhull noticed that post Sesta Fosta, we were seeing an increase in censorship of sexuality online, particularly for sex workers who had increasingly relied on the internet to market their services, create safety networks within their communities, connect with others. And we saw folks start to be censored online and deplatformed, which I think is a word we're going to use a lot today. Basically, that means losing access to an internet platform like a social media account or Instagram, things like that. And we also noticed that, or we theorized that this was going to have a very real life impact on a lot of sex workers and other people sort of in the sexuality field, right? As a lot of folks who are tuning in today know, Woodhull fought against FOSTA in federal court. We were the lead plaintiff on a lawsuit suing the government, saying that that piece of legislation was unconstitutional. And so we wanted to see sort of what are the actual impacts, right? Like, we know what people are telling us, right? We know what our community members and our supporters are sharing with us, but we needed real data, right? To be able to talk to a legislator, to be able to talk to the press. And so that's kind of how this study came about. But I would love to, I'm going to stop talking because you all hear me so much every month. I would love to hear from you, Sam and Melissa. Sort of tell us about what was going on in the world prior to this study, and what kind of led to this research. What were you hoping to find?
Melissa, I think you're going to take this one, or the first part of it.
Sure. As Mandy described, this new law was passed in 2018, and it takes a little while to see the effects of legislation. And while people immediately started looking at what was happening, and sex workers immediately saw websites close, and other people saw websites close as well, really documenting a chilling effect on internet spaces. This is the law that made platforms responsible for content posted by their users. And I'm very happy that Woodhull has pursued the lawsuit, and other people have engaged in research about what has happened to sex workers in the interim since 2018. And then we started this project in 2022. And I think Sam was going to tell us more about the research itself.
Well, sure. There has been a significant number of research about sex work and online platforms up to when we started the study, but we were especially interested in the post-COVID era. And so our study actually started in 2022, and most of the lockdowns in most states in the United States had ended, and work for many people had moved online and would actually stay there. I think all of us right now know that in some way we are working virtually in any capacity. And so this included also, by many estimates, more people doing sex work online in the post-COVID era. And were the platforms more or less friendly now to sex workers? We wanted to know, given the increase in their use for work. We also wanted to know more generally, and this is something that hasn't been studied as much in the US context, what platforms sex workers are actually using and for what. So there was a little bit of this in the UK in the pre-COVID era, and we wanted to see what was happening in the US. So just what kinds of platforms were people using and what were they doing with these platforms? Because we really figured we couldn't understand deplatforming and online censorship without knowing the platforms that sex workers were using and what they were using them for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if you could speak just very briefly to what data was sort of already out there, like what research in this area was existing, and what were you kind of hoping to build on? Like what wasn't there also?
Sure, yeah, I could take this one. So just very broadly speaking, I think it's important to say for context that as long as there have been technological developments, sex workers have adapted to them. So whether it's been the automobile, the telephone, the VCR, the DVD, and then you have the internet and these online platforms. Sex workers have always been pioneers here. And so there has been scholarship just on their technological use and their experiences with different technologies. I'm thinking here of Angela Jones's amazing book on camming, for example, and sex workers using camming platforms. But more specifically, there has been research about sex workers' experiences with online platforms and the censorship they experience there, namely looking at deplatforming, which we've talked about, which is when someone either a platform disappears or someone has their account removed from a platform, but also something harder to tell called shadow banning, which is when a person's account isn't removed per se, but they're instead hidden or harder to find on a platform. And so there's been a lot of published research on this topic. And in 2022, when we started our study, we actually found that one of the earliest studies of deplatforming was from 2015. And this was led by Kristen D'Angelo and Rachel Anderson from the Sex Workers Outreach Project and the Safer Alternatives Through Networking Education in Sacramento. And they were studying the effects of the closure of My Red Book, which was one of the first escort sites that had been shut down by federal agents. And it was a site where women generally advertised to a male clientele and had a lot of clients in the Sacramento area. So they predicted there'd be a higher incidence of street-based work and violence following the closure of this website. And they did find some evidence of this. Then there was a lot of research that came in the wake of 2018, where we had Sesta Fosta and also the closure of Backpage. And so, most notably, the collective Hacking and Hustling did some really incredible studies, Erased and Posting into the Void, and work that they've published in various journals like the Anti-Trafficking Review and Porn Studies. And also Coyote, Rhode Island in 2018 started an impact survey that's been ongoing. We've also had a number of other academic studies like by Jennifer Musto and her colleagues, and as well as a number of international scholars looking at this work. And then, of course, since then, Tara Burns and Coyote, Rhode Island have continued their work through Community United for Safety and Protection. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has done work, so has the Free Speech Coalition. Melissa Michaels at SexWork CEO. So I could go on. There's a lot of research by both community groups and academics. And what is all this research finding effectively? Well, online censorship through deplatforming and shadow banning, among other measures, has had very negative impacts on sex work. So we found obviously the big one is a loss of income, a loss of safety. So this makes sex workers less able to communicate with each other and their peers and also to screen clients. And even though law enforcement has been no friend to sex workers, it's made it harder for law enforcement to actually investigate trafficking and other online crimes related to sex work. It's also declined community for sex workers. It's made it harder to communicate and just have build solidarity, but also it chills speech. So we found that many marginalized groups, including sex workers, have felt less comfortable producing content and communicating about their work. So our study wanted to build on these. We wanted to look whether these existing issues were still a thing in the post-COVID era. But also we wanted to look at others that were less explored. So we wanted to look at deplatforming's impact on specific groups and issues. So did it, for example, impact people's immigration status? How did sexual and other racial minority group discrimination happen? How were persons with disabilities being treated and impacted through deplatforming? And then, of course, we wanted to also take a step back and get a very large national sample. So we wanted to reach sex workers across the United States and learn about the platforming they're using more generally.
Yeah. Not ambitious at all.
No, easy cheesy.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's dive into this study. And before we get to the results, I would love to know a little bit about how this study was designed. Who was involved, because I understand there was quite a bit of community involvement when you were both developing this research. And so, walk us through a little bit of that. Before we get to the results, how did you set it all up?
I would love to talk about our community partners many of whom I had not met before we started this project and who I have come to see as my new best friends or people I reach out to when I need advice about things. And they include, in alphabetical order, Central Ohio Sex Worker Outreach, Community United for Safety and Protection, which is mostly in Alaska, the Ho History Project in the Midwest, primarily run by African American women, Red Canary Song in New York, working on most of the East Coast now, and reaching out specifically to Asian people, Asian women in the sex industry mostly, but as I understand. St. James Infirmary, I lament the end of the infirmary in San Francisco. We had two individual partners. There was Elle Stanger in Portland, and we had another individual who has always said she does not need thanks. But our New York City individual partner really, really helped us with our formative research about technology and how to phrase questions. Sam, do you want to talk about what they did, or do you want me to carry on?
Sure, I can take this part on. So again, I will just second, third, fourth, fifth Melissa's praise for our community partners who we could not have done this study without them. So just to be clear, everybody was paid on this project. We didn't want this to be a product of uncompensated labor. And so our community partners were essential for helping us develop the study, which had two components. So there was first a large national survey, and then out of the survey, we interviewed a number of respondents in more depth. And so this is working with the community partners was essential because we wanted the survey to be thorough and accessible, but also trustworthy. So we were hoping that, people, for example, who had used the St. James Infirmary for their healthcare services would also know that this survey was safe and reliable because it came out of the community. So we knew some things we wanted to ask on the survey from the existing research, which we already kind of went through, but we wanted to know a number of other things. And so we drafted a list of survey topics and we met with our community partners, and they told us a lot. They told us things we should add, that we should remove, They gave us a lot of brilliant insights about how to word questions, told us things to ask about that we didn't think of, and they told us also what questions might be better for the interviews. Again, we could not have done this without them. We then programmed the survey into Qualtrics software, which is the major survey software. And here, a special shout out goes out to Melissa Ditmore, survey programming genius extraordinaire. And once we had the survey programmed, we tested it with 14 sex workers across the country who are community partners, helped us recruit in every time zone in the US. And we went through the survey with them as they did it. And they told us where questions didn't make sense. Did things in the survey technology not work? And they also told us a lot of other things to ask, which was really useful. So once we finalized the survey, we then distributed it in what turned out to be 2 phases. So in the first phase, we had our community partners post the survey through their social media and through their email lists. And we had to do this because this is not a community where there is just a national list of sex workers, for example, and you can just send everybody a one-time survey link. And so we collected a number of responses, but we also soon realized that we were getting a lot of fraudulent responses. This is not unique to doing survey research in the sex work community. This is just a reality of doing online research. And so we had to rethink how we were going to distribute the survey in a second round. And so what we did is we sent out a survey where we just collected people's email addresses. We then reviewed the IP addresses to make sure they weren't from data centers, for example. We looked at latitude and longitude to make sure they were in the United States. And then we sent out the survey, a one-time survey link to these respondents who volunteered their email addresses. So altogether, we collected 440 survey responses, which we believe is one of the largest studies to date of sex workers about their use of online platforms, and everyone was paid $20 per response. We then did in-depth interviews. So at the end of the survey, people could indicate if they wanted to complete an interview with us. And so what we did was what's called systematic sampling, where we basically invited every 10th respondent who said they wanted to do an interview. So this would make sure that we weren't biased in our sampling. And so we did 40 interviews. Everyone was paid $75 for a 1-hour interview. And here we went into more depth about their sex work experiences, the platforms they used, what they liked and disliked about these platforms, their experiences with deplatforming and shadow banning, knowledge about laws and regulations. And we also got a lot of information in depth from sex workers about how they were resisting current laws and also protecting themselves online. And I think, as Melissa will show, this data is incredible, both in the qualitative and quantitative measures. We've reached sex workers across the country and from almost every walk of life. And so we're really excited to share this.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's really helpful for those of us who are not in academia, not doing research. We don't quite understand the whole process behind all of this, how all these numbers come to be. So I really appreciate you providing that background. I think it's time to get into the results. I feel like I've been teasing our audience, and so I would love to tell us what did you find?
I want to talk about the survey results as the person who was really knee deep in the survey data. Our sample of 440 sex workers is a mix of a variety of people online and offline. We wanted to reach people who have used the internet for their work. But a lot of people use both the internet and in-person spaces. We reached a very demographically diverse range of individuals across the US who use online platforms extensively to engage in sex work, both virtually and in person. Our sample reflects that data collected in previous research, like that UK study Sam mentioned, bolstering our sense that the sample reflects the reality of sex workers in the US today. So I said we wanted to hear from people who had ever done sex work using the internet. This could mean using it for advertising, in-person services like escorting or stripping, or working entirely online, as with camming, or creating online content. We asked what kinds of sex work people had ever done, with choices including BDSM, street-based sex work, brothels, making pornography, and more. 70% of our 440 people reported doing camming, phone sex, sexting, video calls, that's all one choice. And 40% had ever created online content. So we really reached online workers as we wanted to learn about their platform use. But many also reported in-person work. 35% of people reported escorting, and 25% reported doing street-based sex work. 21% reported working in a brothel and 18% in a dungeon. People could choose as many responses as fit their history. So this is why these numbers add up to more than 100 for those of you who are paying that much attention. More than half of our respondents reported being under 35 years of age. There were a lot in the 26 to 35 age category. And this makes sense for us. Another quarter were between 36 and 49, and we had 11 respondents over 50, including people who were senior citizens. Our focus on online work contributes to this age range that's skewed young. More than half of our respondents were born between 1987 and 2004. These are digital natives who were born and came of age when online technologies were available to sex workers and the general population. Do you want more info about age?
No, but I think that's really interesting. I love that we get a broad spectrum of folks. Yeah.
For even as our sample was predominantly white with 63%, but we also had nearly 20% Black or African American, which is a little higher than the national average, than the national proportion. 7% Hispanic or Latinx, and that's a little lower. 5% multiracial or biracial, and 4% Asian or Pacific Islander, that's lower than the typical states, and 1% Native American or Alaskan Native. So that's actually smack on the demographics for the country. But Asian people are particularly underrepresented, and maybe Latinx, depending on who chose whether to identify as white or Black or Latin. For gender, our community partners helped us develop a list of 12 genders to choose from, and the most common were women and transgender women. 435 people responded to our question, what is your gender identity? And we had 280 cisgender women. That's 64%. That's a lot. I mean, but I also think that the sex industry may be 2/3 cisgender women. I'm not certain. We had 48 trans women in our sample, more than 10%. So that's 75% women. The next most common categories were man and non-binary. And but in addition to those, 57 respondents reported identifying as a combination of transgender men and intersex and other smaller categories like autogender or I'm sorry, I'm blanking on all of our 11 choices, but we ended up putting these 57 into one category that we lumped together to be non-binary, gender non-conforming, androgyne, agender, demigender. So that was more than 10% of our sample. That was 12% of people who did not fit any of the typical categories, including transgender women. That was interesting. Sam pointed out that we wanted to reach a wide range geographically. We asked people where they live, and 431 people told us, not 431, 431 responses recorded a US state or territory as their place of residence. We had a couple from the Canadian border, just the other side. The majority of our respondents were from the most populous states, California, New York, Florida, and Texas. Most studies focus on coastal cities, but we reach people throughout the country, including rural areas and states and territories we don't hear much from, like South Dakota, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Puerto Rico, and many more from the Midwest and the South. We also asked about housing status, and 404 people answered our question about housing. The greatest number, 47%, reported renting, 11% reported homeownership, and 12% reported no fixed address. We have more about that. Our data really reflect the ongoing housing crisis. Only 63% of our sample reported stable housing. That is more than a third being in unstable housing. Stable housing was renting from a landlord, being a homeowner, and living in public housing. But 20% of our sample reported homelessness, including no fixed address, staying in vehicle, camping, couch surfing, other unstable housing. And still another 12% reported that their housing was really precarious, living at a shelter, living in a client's residence, being in a program that includes housing. Some people reflected more than one category, typically reflecting being undomiciled or homeless. Staying in a vehicle and living in a hotel were the most common combination, sometimes accompanied by living in clients' residence. These combinations reflect the ways people in precarious housing cobble together places to stay. For Woodhull's audience, I wanted to include sexual orientation. We had 10 categories based on consultations with community partners and in line with contemporary discussions of sexuality. The greatest number of responses were heterosexual, which you might expect, but much lower than the general population. We had 47% of people say that they were heterosexual. And the next most common categories were bisexual, pansexual, and queer. We'll let you look at the chart, and if you have questions, please post them in the chat. Thank you. We asked about disability. Most studies don't. Most studies of sex workers don't, and we asked about disability. And 21% of our sample self-identified as disabled. They didn't tell us, we didn't ask about what kind of disability, whether this is an invisible or visible disability. But what we really learned is that the sex industry, as much as any Social Security or other social program in the United States, is supporting sex workers. The sex industry is not only supporting sex workers, but people who are disabled. Annie Sprinkle always jokes the sex industry supports more artists than the National Endowment for the Arts. I think we might have to start thinking about disability on a similar line, as the sex industry is an unofficial safety net for people in the United States.
Melissa, that is so interesting. I'm particularly struck by the fact that you accounted for 12 different genders, which I think is awesome. I think we sort of knew already anecdotally that sex workers were a population of a lot of folks who who have disabilities, but it's great to actually have that as a data point in your study. So thank you for sharing that. Could you tell us a little bit about what platforms folks reported using and where they were experiencing or where they were using for their work, what they were using for their work, rather?
We asked about a wide range of platforms. I'm really happy to talk about this. We asked about advertising and payment processors and dating platforms and message boards and things specific to online work like content storage and camming and chatting platforms, feed sites and clip stores and tube sites, as well as social media and things that are not traditionally considered sex work platforms. Unsurprisingly, for the sex industry, which is really all about earning money, payment processors were the most frequently used, the most frequently cited. And that was followed by camming. Remember, 70% of our sample said that they had engaged specifically in camming and phone sex. Sexting, video call platforms. These are like MyFreeCams and everybody's favorite Night Flirt. Others that were very high were chatting and social media. These were used for business, more so than advertising, which I was surprised. Advertising and dating and hookup platforms were pretty similar. I'd like to talk a little bit about deplatforming. we asked about, have you experienced deplatforming? We also asked about shadow banning, but instead of saying shadow banning, because people have very different definitions, we tried to be specific. This is another one of our topics that our community partners really helped with, saying, well, shadow banning means a bunch of different things. Let's talk about tagability, and do you come up in search online on different platforms if people are searching for you? So being shadow banned can mean that you can't be tagged or that you can't be found in the search results. And we found that more than 70%, nearly 3/4, reported having ever lost access to a platform. And people were unsure about shadow banning, but the people who were least likely to experience shadow banning were cisgender women, and the people who were most likely to experience shadow banning were a lot of disabled people were disproportionately reported having been shadow banned. And one of the ways people become shadow banned is that their content is reported as unsuitable or inappropriate. And I would love for someone to look deeper into why are disabled people more likely to report having been shadow banned than others.
Me too. I think that would be really interesting. And I think one of the words I've started to hear used for shadow banning now is like down ranking. Um, I don't know if it's different, but I know shadow banning goes by many different names. Um, so what conclusions can we draw from the study? Obviously, we can't draw every single conclusion, but what do you think are some safe conclusions or some interesting things that we can learn from your data?
Well, actually, before we do that, but Melissa, should we share some of the major effects of deplatforming that we found?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the effects that we found were the slide from, once you lose access to a platform, if you're not able to reach your clients, you're not able to generate the same amount of money. So we saw drops in income. We asked about the knock-on effects of, did your income decline? Did your income stay the same? Did your income increase? Very few people reported increases, but some did. And many more people reported that their income declined. And we asked, did your income recover? And most people reported that their income recovered, thinking about the money in sex work. So we saw that deplatforming hurt sex workers in particular ways. Some people became more precarious in their housing. Some people faced a hardship, including food insecurity. But we also learned that sex workers are very resilient and that the industry will bounce back from deplatforming, it seems, and shadow banning. Sam, did you want to add more, or did you want me to come
sure,
up
yeah.
talk about more data?
So I could just add, just from what we saw with the data. I mean, we asked this separate question about income loss and that, as Melissa said, was the major effect. Most people, the survey said, have you ever been deplatformed? And then the people who answered yes were then asked a series of follow-up questions about the effects. And so our community partners really helped us create this very long list of potential effects people could choose from. So, one of the effects we asked about obviously was income loss, which, as Melissa said, was a huge proportion lost income, but then also these knock-on effects, like you lost clients, you lost access to your networks, and then that, of course, has income effects that pile on. We asked about things like, did you return to street-based sex work? And actually, the numbers were quite low on that one. That wasn't as significant as an effect as we thought it would be. But we also asked about things like, did you have increased interactions with child protective services, for example? Did this hurt your immigration status? And for the most part, the effects of that were not as high as we anticipated. But definitely the income loss and the related consequences like content loss and client loss really seem to, I think, pile on together the most.
Another aspect of that was the loss of community, losing networks, not only client networks, but networks with other sex workers and emotional and social support.
Which I think is so important. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because one of the things we raised as an issue in our FOSTA suit was the fact that a lot of resources sex workers use online are to keep each other safe, right? I'm thinking of things like bad date lists and things like that, and talking about how FOSTA would have a direct impact on this community's ability to keep itself safe. Right. So thank you for raising that. And thank you, Sam, also for not letting me sort of jump the gun there to your conclusions. Appreciate that. But yeah, what were some of the conclusions? What are some of the things we can draw from all of this fabulous data you collected?
Well, one thing I'd like to emphasize is, that the incredible resilience of the sex worker community. And so this is something we saw not only in the survey responses where we had some open text formats where people could write in different things, but also obviously in our in-depth interviews. So, I don't want people to draw the conclusion that the sex worker community is doomed in light of things like SESTA, FOSTA, and deplatforming and the COVID pandemic. Because we really saw that, while there were things like income loss and social isolation and loss of networks and community, there were also many gains, you could argue. So we found, especially in our in-depth interviews, that sex workers really continued to share information with each other. They talked about the different forums they use. Some are specific to the type of sex work they use. Some are more open forums to share not only information about how to keep themselves safe online, but also and to prevent things like deplatforming, but also to share information about laws and different policies and activism and actions that they can take to fight against these things. And we also saw, especially in the interviews, that sex workers doing a lot of work to mobilize each other politically. So, particularly around informing their peers about what the platforms are doing. So, we kind of have two policy levels here. We have the platform's own policies, but then we have federal and state laws, things like SESTA, FOSTA, and sex workers were definitely creating what we call feedback effects here. So they were informing each other about, hey, here's this thing that such and such a platform is doing. Here's a way to keep yourself safe and avoid that consequence. But then also, here is a law that is currently being debated federally or at the state level, and here are some things that you can do about it. So we really found, a continuation from our scholarship and that of others that shows this really incredible resistance as well.
Absolutely. I was in Albany, New York recently for an advocacy day with Decrim New York, and the sex worker community was very vocal, and there was a ton
Mhm.
of us there advocating for New York State's Decrim bill, SVSTA. So awesome. I'm so glad that came through in the data.
Mhm.
Um, were there any limits of the study? Anything that you sort of wish you could have gotten a little bit more information about?
Before we go to limits, I want to talk about a last thing that surprised me in the data. I had mentioned about um, the number of people who identified as disabled in our sample being more than 20%, more than 1 in 5. If you think about sitting in a restaurant and more than 1 in 5 people, if it's a group of sex workers, more than 1 in 5 would perhaps self-identify as disabled. In addition to so many being disabled, they typically had lower incomes, typically under $35,000 a year. But when they reported being deplatformed or shadow banned, their incomes dropped less, which may be that they're just not, there's less distance to fall. They have a lower income, but they were better able to weather deplatforming than others, in part We don't know why, but it does seem that even as they might be targeted for shadow banning or reporting, that they are also perhaps beneficiaries of a devoted clientele. I would love for someone to engage, to learn more about that. I'd love to hear other people's input to that in the chat too.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love feedback. So yeah, thank you for that. So any limits of the study, anything we should think about that you couldn't quite find in the course of your work?
Sure, I could start with some of them. So one, we would like to reach a wider range of sex workers. We acknowledge that, the majority of our respondents were white cis women, and we would like to reach more gender and sexually diverse sex workers, and of course, also more racially diverse sex workers as well. We also think it would be really fascinating to engage in more international comparison. There is a lot of research emerging that shows that things like SESTA FOSTA affect sex workers not only in the US, but also internationally, especially because work is now online. You may have clients in different countries, right, with different laws in those jurisdictions. And so a lot of the research right now on the platforms sex workers are using and their experiences is coming out of the US and the UK to date. But I think we need to go beyond this and especially look more at countries in the global south, because these typically have very young and tech savvy populations. And it would be really interesting to learn more about how they're navigating platforms and their policies, particularly in the context of sex work.
I would like to add here that in addition to US policy, I'd love to know how other privacy laws, for example, Europe's GDPR, affect the sex trade and everyone internationally. We have a real limitation in that our survey was available only in English. And I had said earlier that Hispanic and Latinx people and Asian people were underrepresented in our study sample. Had we had the ability to offer the survey in Spanish, Chinese, Korean, that might have really changed the survey and the respondents.
Thank you for sharing all of that. Were there any additional findings that surprised you?
Yes. Yeah. The one that's most surprising to everybody that we've spoken to about this so far, we asked people who reported that a payment processor had suspended their account or terminated their account, whether the payment processor kept their money. And then if people responded yes, and a lot of them did, like I think 70%, I don't remember the exact numbers, but of them, they said, we asked them, did you try to get your money back? Have you gotten your money back yet? And the responses included yes, no, and still trying. But what we learned was that for people whose money was retained by the payment processor, it's very hard to get the money back, with 70% of people saying not yet, they're still trying, or they did not get their money back. So payment processors are enriching themselves on the backs of sex workers, which is criminal, actually. There's a word for that.
Because actually with the payment processors, they and one thing that was really fascinating is we asked the survey respondents, do you read the platform's terms of service, right? So this is where platforms kind of lay out, these are the rules and this is what will let you keep your account and this is what might get your account suspended. And we had a very high percentage of people who claimed to have read or at least loosely read the terms of service. And so it's one thing if the payment processor is not returning your funds because of some violation of the terms of service. But that wasn't always clear in this case, especially since we found a lot of people didn't get a response from the platforms about why they had kept their money. And then by extension, what was really interesting with the payment processors is how this is kind of become a canary in the coal mine. And that's how, one of our interviews described sex workers in all of this. That, we have kind of, she said, we have been talking about this and saying we've lost access to money. And now suddenly something like the New York Times just reported recently how many other small businesses and other people are also suddenly just losing access to their banks and to their PayPal accounts for no reason, right? And so as one interviewer said to me, and I'll paraphrase, come on over and join us. We've been saying this for a long time, right? And so they also, mentioned in their interviews how this isn't exclusive, this kind of spillover effect of platform loss and payment platform loss. And they expressed how, for example, they've been concerned about period tracker apps, right? And now in the post-Dobbs era, there's a lot of concern about using those period tracker apps because in states where abortion is now illegal, could the police possibly use that information in your period tracker app against you, right? And so this is what we heard, especially in more depth in the interviews, is that, again, we've been talking about these issues for a long time, and the rest of the population really needs to catch up here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just add, in addition to payment processors, I think one of the things we hear a lot, and I don't know if this came up in your study at all, but same thing with banks, people
Mhm,
losing access to bank accounts and not being able to get their funds back.
mhm.
So, yeah. So, speaking of that, and I will segue to my next question. Did any of the data you found support the claims that we often make here at Woodhull, and I think probably things you've heard as well, about online censorship and its impact on sex work?
I'd like to answer that. We asked people how their behavior changed after Sesta Fosta, and they had a great deal to tell us. The most common responses were increasing privacy and security precautions online or exploring alternative platforms. And some people stopped participating in online forums. A third of our study sample stopped participating in some online forums. That's a huge chilling effect. That really is what Woodhull is talking about. There were also, we already talked about wages and revenue lost from losing platforms, and that losing income has knock-on effects like housing instability, increased poverty, sometimes increased involvement with officials and programs and so on. But I think that Woodhull is right to be very concerned about the chilling effect, particularly as a third of our people said that they stopped participating in some
Mhm.
online forums. A smaller number reported not attending a meeting. Um, very few others describe not identifying as a sex worker any longer in particular advocacy or work on political issues. This is really the definition of a chilling effect.
And, with that chilling effect, I think, and as we talked a little bit about earlier, I think the glimmer of hope is that while there is that chilling effect, there has also been community around this chilling effect. And so I think the ways in which, for one, sex workers have learned to protect themselves online and protect their communities and their speech. I think the rest of the population, the non-sex working population, has a lot to learn from that. And then, two, as always has been shown over many, many decades, is sex workers are an incredibly politically savvy and resilient group. And so the ways in which they continue to communicate and share information about platform policies, but also federal and state and local laws and policies that impact their capacity to work, and particularly work online, was really inspiring and informative.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, So we mentioned at the beginning of this program that your study is groundbreaking because it takes a deeper look at sex work online using both survey and interview methods. And I know you mentioned a few things earlier, but anything else specific that you'd like to see studied next Or is there an extension of your current study that you would like to see happen in the future?
Angela Jones has been on the vanguard of sex work research for more than a decade, and her work on disability really is, in part, what led to our including questions about disability, and that is really an untapped mother lode of opportunity for researchers.
I just like to also reiterate expanding and thinking of different ways to reach groups that we didn't have as well represented, persons of color, sexual and gender minorities, I think is really important. And also, I think bringing in this international aspect I think, would be really, I think, the next frontier in this research is doing a broader international comparison.
Yeah, something I'd like to add, not being a researcher, but just throwing it onto the pile,
Mhm.
is something we've seen in this past 2 years is the rise of online age verification laws
Mhm.
for sites that have explicit content. Currently being challenged in a couple places, but I think there's like over 20 states now that have passed some sort of age verification measure.
Mhm.
And I would think it would be really interesting, probably maybe a little too early to see the impact of that in the research, but maybe a year or two down the road, I think it'd be very interesting to see um, how the data might be different with
You
Well,
those
and
could
kind of
actually,
laws
use
implemented.
you could use sex workers as a case study for that, because many sites where sex workers advertise have age verification policies, and that helps them um, avoid committing trafficking by dealing with anyone who is under 18. However, this has already led to doxing of individual sex workers with their vital statistics online about age and where they live and so on. So this is an opportunity for someone to look at sex workers as the canaries in the coal mine, the vanguard of who will be most affected by not particularly well thought out policies. The implementation is key to anything. The devil is in the details, and that is what has led to sex workers having to relocate in some instances.
and actually, I'll just add with the verification. One thing we learned about in more depth in the interviews is not only age verification, but gender verification.
Hmm.
And so, a number of sex workers we interviewed talked about working collaboratively, for example, in creating content, whether this was pornography or some kind of camming show. And in cases, they had to upload ID to verify not only age, but when the sites would then check the identification, if they were working with trans or other gender nonconforming people, they would often run into problems of verification where, the site might say, for example, well, this doesn't look like a woman, right? And so that would also create problems then for these people to complete their work and to earn income creating content. So I think this combination of not only the effect of age verification, but also gender verification, because in the US, we know there is a lot of variation in state ID laws and how easy it is to change and make sure your gender affirms your own identity as well in your paperwork.
Yeah, and becoming increasingly difficult to do that
Hmm.
in many states, right? With the rise of a lot of anti-trans laws, anti-LGB
Hmm.
laws. Um, yeah, excellent point. Really, I think important to think about. I am so looking forward to reading your data when it's in a report. And I'm so glad that we were able to have you as a part of our censorship series this month. Before we wrap up, any last thoughts or ideas that you want to share with our viewers about the work, the research, anything at all while we have the last few minutes?
I want to thank our community partners again, and also the thousands of people who took the survey, but especially the 440 valid responses.
And an extra special thank to those out of the respondents who also sat with us for an interview. We really appreciate that. And I'll just add it as an update. At the moment, we currently have 3 papers in process. 2 under review at different scholarly journals. This process is very slow, but as soon as the papers are hopefully accepted for publication and out, we'll be sure to share those with Woodhull as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will be sharing this information, as you mentioned, as soon as it's available in published form for people to see. I also want to give a plug for Woodhull's Fact Check program, which is a different kind of resource talking about the facts related to sexual expression, and that's available on our website already, and I will include a link in our follow-up email. So, Sam, Melissa, again, thank you so much for being here. I haven't really been involved in the research, and so this was my first time hearing a lot of this data, and I was really excited to learn it firsthand from both of you. So, thank you again. And folks who are tuning in, thanks for being here. Just a reminder, this recording will go up on Woodhull's YouTube page, so you can watch it again and again and again and share it with all of your friends and colleagues. I will also be sending a follow up email with a lot of the resources we mentioned, as well as a list of those community partners who worked so hard to help make this study possible. So, thank you to all of them. And lastly, if you learned something today, or if you're going to use any of this good data to do the all important policy and advocacy work in your neighborhood, please head over to woodhullfoundation.org/donate. We work really hard to make these programs free and accessible to everybody, but they're not free to produce, and neither is this research. So if you're willing and able, please head on over and make a gift to Woodhull today. So thanks again, everybody, and I will see you back here next month.